Szanowni Państwo, dziś mam przyjemność polecić kolejną książkę naszego patrona, wydawnictwa Derezio, pod tytułem Prawdziwy Izrael, fałszywy judaizm, autorstwa księdza Jeana-Michel Gleize. Jest to, można by powiedzieć, teologiczny i filozoficzny tour de force o tym, czym jest judaizm, o jego esencji, metodą scholastyczną, prowadzenie ku prawdzie bez żadnej politycznej poprawności i zbędnych, że tak powiem, ekumenizmów. Tę książkę i inne znajdziecie w linku wydawnictwa Derezio, który to link jest dzisiaj załączony w naszym programie. Polecam bardzo serdecznie. Dr Michał Krupa.
Good evening, everyone. It's Mike Krupa, your host of drglobal, the English language podcast of Do Rzeczy, Poland's largest conservative weekly. And we are on, let me count, we're already on episode 13 of our podcast. You guys know how many great guests we've had so far, the topics we've covered, mostly geopolitics, but today we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into a very interesting historical episode, I think a very important historical episode. Guys, before we move on today's interview, remember to like and subscribe to our channel. It definitely helps us grow. Remember also that you can support us via Buy Me Coffee, or for our Polish listeners, by zrzutka.pl. All the links are in the description box. Also, we would like to thank our patron, Derezio Publishing House. The link to Derezio's books is also in the description box. A lot of great offers Derezio has for the intellectual connoisseur. You've probably seen the ad that I do before every episode talking about at least one Derezio book. That's obviously directed to our Polish readers, but if you're an international reader and you'd like to learn some Polish, why not? Buy a Derezio book, of course. So remember to check them out. Guys, we're very honored today to have with us Ken McCarthy. I actually came across Ken a few months back. I do a little bit of a deep dive myself on the Kennedy assassination. I'm probably the only or one of the few guys in Poland who reads books about James Jesus Angleton, the CIA, the Mossad angle. You know, it just fascinates me, the entire story of the assassination of President Kennedy. And Ken has written a very interesting book which shines a new light on, possibly the reasons why JFK might have been killed, and on the background of JFK and RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr., that is, his brothers, fight against the Zionist influence, which was already very prevalent in the United States in the 50s and 60s. The book is called JFK and RFK's Battle Against Zionist Extremism, and we will have the link for you in the description box also. So I'd like to welcome to the show Ken McCarthy. How are you doing today, Ken?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, and it's nice to be speaking to people in Poland.
It's an honor for us too. We'd love to have controversial, politically incorrect figures and people who write interesting books. Yours is definitely up there when it comes to JFK. Maybe as a little bit of a backgrounder, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, Ken, where can people find you, and what nudged you to write such an interesting book on one of history's most, shredded in secrecy episodes?
Good. Well, if people are interested in this book or my other books, I have a website called Brass Check Books, all one string, brasscheckbooks.com. I also have a website called brasscheck.com. I come from a business background, a tech background, actually. I was fairly early in the formative years of the commercial internet, and always been interested in history, been a JFK assassination skeptic since I was a boy. I read a book very early in my life, and it was quite compelling. And like many millions of people, I've been curious endlessly about how on earth did the president of the United States get shot in the head in front of hundreds of eyewitnesses, and nobody can tell you exactly how it happened all these years later. So I've always kept my eye on it. I will say too, I have worked with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on environmental things, primarily medical. I was a contributor to the Real Anthony Fauci, contributor of content. I was also pretty much the main leader of the marketing of that book. And I'll tell everybody I was surprised, disappointed, shocked to see Robert F. Kennedy take the side of Israel in this situation in Gaza. And so I actually wrote this book largely with the intention of him seeing this material. Um, and I hoped it would help persuade him to look at the situation differently. So that's sort of the background story.
That's a valid point, I think, that you made, because I think the Fauci book actually is translated into Polish, because during the COVID time, a lot of the dissidents, I was one of them, or millions of us, thankfully, who still value our freedom and personal liberty in Poland. We very much valued RFK Jr.'s stance on the COVID issue and how he was trying to push the truth out there. Obviously, I think we can say that he's doing fairly well as the Secretary of Health and Human Services right now in the United States. Although, as you said, even when he was campaigning for the presidency and now as part of the Trump administration, I think you would expect a lot more from him when it comes to the topic of Israel. So I was wondering if, without maybe giving out too many spoilers, because we obviously encourage our audience to get the book, if you could just give us a brief tour de force of what the book is about and what it contains in general.
Gotcha. Well, the book is built around government documents that had been classified until relatively recently. And we're talking about letters and telegrams and diplomatic cables. And they, like I said, they've been classified. Nobody knew of the existence of these documents until the 21st century. And so the book is the actual documents. I'm not referring to the documents. I actually put the documents in the book. You can read the text. You can see the facsimiles as well. And there was clearly a very serious battle going on between the Kennedy administration, both John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, with the government of Israel. And the reason in the title, I use the term Zionist extremists is I'm trying to be kind to Israel and Israelis. I'm attributing all these evil deeds that they're currently engaged in to Zionists and extremists, because I know there are a few Israelis that are against what's going on. So that's why the title refers to Zionist extremists. And the other reason I use that term is I'm looking at the history and being objective. I don't know if there was ever a time when Israel wasn't controlled by Zionist extremists, and they call themselves Zionists. So I don't think that's slander. And I do think killing civilians, driving them from their homes by the hundreds of thousands, locking them down in open air prison camps, and then slaughtering them as they're doing in Gaza, I think that's pretty extreme. Now, back in the 60s, the issue that Kennedy had was the Israelis. And by the way, I've learned recently that Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president before Kennedy, actually talked with Kennedy during the handoff of power about the issue of Israel having nuclear weapons or developing them. And if we go back to that era, only a few countries had them. And the great dream of John F. Kennedy, one of his great dreams, but clearly top priority for him, one of the top priorities, was to stop nuclear proliferation. He had just succeeded in a test ban. Believe it or not, previous to that, all kinds of countries, the US was blowing up nuclear weapons in Nevada, and France was blowing them up in the Pacific and in Algeria. Russia was blowing them up, in the open air, with the fallout, circling the world. And John F. Kennedy succeeded in getting every country that admitted having nuclear weapons to sign a nuclear test ban. So that was huge. The next thing that he wanted to do was stop new weapons being made. And then the third thing he wanted to do was to have those weapons dismantled. This is a war veteran. This is a man with small children. This is a man with a heart. And he realized how dangerous nuclear weapons were. And he did not want them to be spread beyond who already had them. And he wanted to shut down everybody, including the United States, that had them. So the idea of Israel covertly developing their own nuclear weapons program was something that he was very concerned about and was not happy about. And as the years went on, it got to be the summer of 1963. And he issued a direct threat to Israel finally, which is, if you don't let us into your so-called research center in Dimona, we are going to be withdrawing our support for your country. And Israel, I think everybody's aware, cannot live a day without very abundant support from the United States, both financial, military, and diplomatic. So the day that the United States government stops supporting Israel is the day Israel has to behave like a normal country and not a criminal regime. So that issue was that threat, and it wasn't belligerent. It was just a matter of fact. Hey, we're not going to keep paying your bills if you're doing something that we think is against peace in the Middle East and peace in the world. And again, these documents were classified. Like no one could read them in the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s or until pretty recently in the 21st century. So they were kept secret. They're now available and they're all in the book. So in addition to that, I also have a timeline that shows that during the pre-Kennedy administration, the U.S. was on a killing spree, running coups all over the world. And during Kennedy, it slowed down. It didn't stop, but it slowed down significantly. And after Kennedy was killed, the murder spree resumed, including the murder of nearly 1 million ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. All supported and coordinated and funded and encouraged by our CIA. So when we look at possible suspects in the Kennedy assassination, the CIA comes up a lot, and he clearly slowed down their covert actions, and they clearly resumed full scale after he was dead. So that's a potential suspect. We often talk about organized crime figures being involved. We talk about Cubans who were all criminals. They talk about the Cubans that had to leave when Castro came in. Those were all people that were working with the Batista regime and were working hand in glove also with the gangsters that ran the very lucrative and very important entertainment industry in Cuba. And they had to leave because they had been killing Cuban civilians. They were basically the people that worked for the casinos were also moonlighting as death squad operatives, killing opponents of the Batista regime. So when the Castro came in, they had to leave town, and those people are also implicated in the killing of Kennedy. Sometimes certain elements of French intelligence are implicated, but the one group that you were not allowed to implicate until relatively recently, and I don't think my book is the only thing that has opened the discussion. I think Israel's behavior in Gaza has gotten people to rethink how they look at the country. But it was not permitted until very recently to even suggest that Israel might have had a motivation and might have even had a role in the actual mechanics of the killing, not only of John F. Kennedy, but Robert Kennedy. So that's the long arc of the book. And then I did a fairly extensive essay in the book on the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, because there the fingerprints indicate either Zionist involvement or someone who was extremely friendly to the Zionist cause. Even more so than the Kennedy assassination. Though there's plenty of evidence of Zionist criminal involvement in the John F. Kennedy assassination as well. So that's basically the book. The cables and telegrams and letters that had previously been classified, this chronology, which I think is unique, but it's the actual historical chronology showing pre-Kennedy, during Kennedy, and after Kennedy, the acceleration, deceleration, and then massive acceleration of covert action involving the murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians. And then also this, I think, fairly unique view on the Robert F. Kennedy assassination.
It's interesting because if you look at, Zionist outlets, generally, especially the ones situated in the United States, if you were to sort of not know of the existence of your book or some tidbits here and there from previous years, about the Kennedys' relations with the early Israel/Zionist lobby in the United States during the campaign, the presidential campaign where Kennedy won over Nixon in 60. You would think, and the message is that President Kennedy was a great friend of Israel. I mean, he was up there with Reagan, that RFK was a great friend of Israel, and hence that's why he was assassinated, obviously, by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian. But as you mentioned, as time flows, you move the Overton window, and people begin to ask questions that even just recently would have been anathema. And I think your book is so very important in that regard. I'm a trained historian. That's my master's degree
Oh, you are. Oh,
before
wow. Okay.
I did my political science. So history, especially 20th century history, is a big thing for me. But why do you think, do you think after the publication of this book, it'll be harder for the Zionists to paint, Kennedy as basically one of their own, as what we have today in the White House, basically?
Well, they'll keep painting away. Truth and historical accuracy is not something that they're interested in it at all. And they know, as all propagandists know, that there will always be a percentage of the population that will ignore reality and buy whatever they say. So they're going to keep, telling the nonsensical story that, By the way, Kennedy was respectful to Israel. He wasn't antagonistic. He wasn't hostile, but he was pro peace. He was anti-nuclear weapon, and he was pro-America. And Israel was getting in the way of him doing that. So he was doing what a president should do, which is to call them on it and to let them know what the consequences would be. But yeah, the Zionists will clearly continue forever lying and prevaricating. I mean, that's their business. That's what they do. But now the key, though, is how about the general public? The general public, they once shown the facts, they're going to realize, oh no, Kennedy was not a lapdog of Israel. Quite the contrary. And now and the other thing that we have to look at, and there was another element, which was Robert. Robert was going after the various lobbying groups, one in particular, that was not registering itself with the State Department. In this country allows foreign figures to lobby politicians and the media and private citizens, no problem. But you have to register your existence. You have to register your source of funds. You have to register how you use your funds. You have to register every single activity you take relating to the promotion of the foreign state. It all has to be sent to the State Department. And every country does that. Poland does it. Canada does it. New Zealand does it. Botswana does it. Bolivia does it. There's only one country on earth that doesn't do it, and that's Israel. And they were fighting with Robert Kennedy. And Kennedy was saying, look, you got to register, period. End of story. You got to do it. Of course, once John Kennedy, now, by the way, these things were heating up in the summer of 1963. John Kennedy, as we all know, was killed in the fall of 1963. Once he was killed, Robert F. Kennedy, for all practical purposes, was temporarily neutered. And he had to recover emotionally. He also had to, regroup and run for the president. But both of these things, the nuclear weapons issue and the lobbying in the U.S., these are literally the pillars of Israel's sustenance and survival. I don't know that they need to have nuclear weapons, but they believed they needed to have them. They absolutely knew they needed the ability to lobby illegally in the United States, and they did not want to give that up. And the man who was most threatening those two pillars of their survival just happened to end up being dead in 1963 of the fall. There were a lot of other groups, not just the Zionists. Texas oil men had good reason to see Kennedy dead. CIA people, especially in the covert action branch, wanted to see him dead. The criminals that left from Cuba, who wanted to get back to Cuba, they wanted to see him dead. Organized crime figures in the United States wanted to see. So it was a vast array of people that wanted to see him dead. But what's interesting is the connecting link between all of them actually happens to be Zionists, believe it or not. The Texas oil men, they viewed themselves as a separate country, and they had their own diplomatic initiatives. And they were doing diplomatic work, especially in Latin America. And they used the same attorney to do that diplomatic work with the various dictators in Latin America that was also representing the Zionists in the United States. So there was a slight connection there. the organized crime, which is in the United States, is often attributed to Italian Americans. The truth is, some of the most successful and best organized criminal people in the United States are people of Jewish ancestry. It's just a historical fact. And so anybody that interfered with their business would have potentially made them angry enough to eliminate him. The Cubans had a relationship with Israel, believe it or not. In fact, the man that ran the entertainment, gambling, prostitution, drug business in Cuba was a Zionist, American Jewish person, but he was an ardent Zionist, was involved in smuggling to a guy named Meyer. And the U.S. mob, the organized crime, lost an incredible amount of money when they got thrown out of Cuba. That was their Shangri-La. That was their paradise. They were all in. They were making money hand over fist. The one group that was potentially connected to the assassination was covert action people in the CIA and the counterintelligence people in the CIA, and that's where we get to James Jesus Angleton. And this is a very important name for people to know. He's an American, and yet he has not one but two physical memorials to his life in Israel. When he died, he was commemorated by a meeting of every Mossad active and former leader and government official. Israelis considered him the number one Zionist supporter in the United States. His job was an interesting one. He was the director of counterintelligence for the CIA. And counterintelligence, to explain it briefly, is spying on the spies. That's one of the jobs of counterintelligence. You want to know what all the other intelligence agencies are up to. You also want to spy. You're spying on the spies. You also want to prevent other intelligence agencies from spying on you. And this is very interesting because it means any covert action has to run through the counterintelligence department, right? So if you're doing something covert, you want to keep it secret. To keep it secret, you need to keep it secret from the other intelligence agencies. So by necessity, any shady activities that the CIA is involved in get run through counterintelligence. And the fellow that had that position during both assassinations, James Jesus Angleton, or James Angleton, had held that position for 20 straight years, which is very unusual. Anthony Fauci is another example of someone that held a bureaucratic position in the US government for decades. J. Edgar Hoover, another man implicated in the assassination, he happened to hold the head of the FBI for many decades, and Angleton also held his position for many decades. And the unbelievable thing, which I didn't even realize till I finished writing and publishing the book. And as you know, if you do any writing at all, as soon as you put the last word out to the world, you start learning all these things that you didn't know. Believe it or not, the name of James Angleton was a classified piece of knowledge. This is especially during the 60s. And even today, if you were to Google who is the head of counterintelligence for the United States, CIA, they will not. That's not a disclosable piece of information. Whoever that person is, his identity is secret. So, and we have again, government documents that have been declassified that show very clearly that the intelligence department of the CIA was doing its own deal. They were not they were part of the CIA. They weren't. For instance, their filing system. And if you do espionage or any kind of research, you're going to have a lot of files. Well, normally those files should have been integrated with the overall CIA file structure. James Angleton and counterintelligence then and probably now, they had their own hermetically sealed independent file system. We have a document that unfortunately didn't appear in the book. I only discovered it later, that acknowledges, it's a CIA memo, that Angleton was running and working with our Israeli intelligence agents to conduct operations that were outside of the direct control of the overall CIA. Right. And by the way, that information is now out if somebody reads all the released files. But it was redacted until very, very recently. They've let everything else out about the assassination practically, that they have. Obviously, they destroyed 99% of all the files, and if this was done correctly, there were not that many files to begin with. But the thing that they were keeping secret until the very end, and finally is coming out of the bag, is the fact that Angleton was working directly with Israeli intelligence on all sorts of things outside of the control of the CIA. CIA knew it. The CIA tolerated it. It was institutionally acceptable. The other smoking gun is the man that we've been told killed Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, had been surveilled continuously by the CIA starting in 1959. So the assassination occurred in 63. Well, they knew who he was. They were tracking him since 59. And the identity of the man who was tracking Lee Harvey Oswald, because Angleton couldn't do everything, he had to assign people to do things, his identity was kept secret until just a few years ago. And it turns out he appears to have been a Zionist intelligence operative. His pose was that he was a lawyer specializing in international trade, and therefore he had an office in Tel Aviv and he had an office in Washington, D.C., and he was required, obviously by the nature of his work, to go back and forth between Washington and Israel constantly. By the way, Angleton made dozens of trips to Israel while he was in the CIA. But anyway, this fellow, Angleton, gave him the job of reading the mail of Lee Harvey Oswald. Also, during the Warren Commission, when Oswald's wife was being interrogated, Angleton assigned this particular man to go in and sit in on, not participate in, but sit in on the interrogation and report back to Angleton. Now, Angleton never appeared before the Warren Commission because officially Angleton did not exist. The head of the counterintelligence department was a non-figure. So that's why he never appeared in any of the early investigations. But all that's sort of coming out of the bag finally. I mean, how many decades ago was it? Well, we're finally finding out some of these things.
Yes, the Angleton angle in all of this is especially interesting. If you watch the movie The Good Shepherd with Matt Damon from a couple of years back, it's a pretty good movie. Obviously, the name Angleton isn't used. I think that the protagonist that Matt Damon played is called Edward Wilson in the movie, but it gives a fairly good, I would say, cinematic, obviously, insight into that dark world and how Angleton operated in those early years. For those who would be interested in seeing even a Christmas-themed movie, because there's a lot of snow in that movie, if I remember correctly. But the Angleton angle is so interesting. When we had the release of the JFK documents at the beginning of the year, which is one of the good things that Trump actually did for historians such as us. I read the previously redacted version of his testimony. I think it was to the Church Committee.
Right.
Very interesting stuff. Yeah, how he was using even Jewish emigres from Poland who left Poland, I think it was after 1968 or in the 60s, to do covert work for the CIA. Apparently, even some of these guys ended up in Cuba, which is, going to make another movie about that. But there is a part even in the testimony that is still redacted. I noticed, I read it very meticulously. I think it goes to like 70 pages, where I think it might have even been Church who asked him about the aspects of the Israeli nuclear program. And he says, can we take this off the record? And that part is still redacted in the document. I know, Jeff Morley and a couple of other, the JFK facts guys, they did talk about this. I know some people were on it that, okay, you've redacted so much, but why keep this a secret still? Is it just, overlooking something? To me, it does seem a little bit intentional if you consider that on the 29th of December, for his 7th visit, I think this year, Benjamin Netanyahu, the war criminal, is going to be visiting President Trump in Mar-a-Lago. There's a lot of things that Israel wants to keep tight, it seems. This would seem to be one of them. And it touches on the aspect that I wanted to ask you regarding the Israeli nuclear issue, because the background to it is also fascinating. If you could just give a brief rundown of how Israel actually acquired the nuclear material, which then became a source of controversy between, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and President Kennedy.
Well, Angleton, by the way, is implicated in the transmission of nuclear weapon grades material from the United States to Israel. In Morley's book, I think he pretty much states it. So that was an act of treason, right? And treason is, the president was crystal clear. We don't want Israel to have nuclear weapons. And so at the very same time that he was making that very clear, and Angleton surely would have known that position, Angleton apparently was involved in making that material available to the Israelis. So that pretty much is treason. There's no statute of limitations on treason, and treason is punishable by death. So I can understand that Angleton would be a little sensitive about talking about that. But basically, there was a uranium processing plant in Western Pennsylvania. It was a privately owned plant, and it was working on behalf of the United States Navy, and the Navy needs lots of nuclear material to run the subs, for example. And it was owned by a man that was an ardent Zionist, like an over-the-top Zionist. And I forget the amount of material, but something like 400 pounds or 400 kilos of weapons grade uranium, enriched uranium, somehow disappeared from the plant over a period of time. And it was more than enough to build, I think they could build as many as 10 nuclear warheads with it. So that appears, and this is not wild-eyed conspiracy theory. The historians that do this as a living pretty much think that's how it happened. And even if you think of the logistics of, gee, how did you even move the material? Well, one of the things that organized crime does very well is move things. They're moving drugs all the time, and in the 40s. They were moving weapons to Israel, organized criminals, organized crime figures, through the New York ports. So the logistics of the transportation, insignificant, not a problem at all. So that's how they got. That appears how they got the weapons, and which means everybody involved in that, Angleton, and any organized crime figure involved in that, had committed, I'm guessing, a capital offense. So that's kind of strong motivation to make sure that the only president that would care doesn't live.
I think you mentioned Morley's book. I think it's called The Ghost, about Angleton. I think I remember that in the book, it was actually the son of the CIA station chief in Tel Aviv, John Haddon, I think was his name, who actually, I think he talked to Morley, where he said that, yeah, my father told me that what Angleton did while working with the Israelis was treason, exactly on this nuclear issue. And I think we also have, we have FBI documents that have been declassified that show exactly, the mysterious disappearance of this nuclear material, that apparently in the night guard, the night that the stuff disappeared, that some weird truck showed up. He was told to shut up if he wants to keep his job. A lot of this stinks to high heaven. And it's never really been, there's great research done on it, but it hasn't really reached the consciousness of the American public the way it should. So definitely that angle of Angleton, that wordplay, is very interesting, and it's good that you touched upon it. Going back now to the aspect of the Israel lobby, Ken, because you mentioned the registration battle to get them to sign up to FAR, the Foreign Agency Registration, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I think it was from the 30s that the United States has, where basically you have to register as a foreign agent.
If I could just give historical, that was put in by FDR in response to all the Nazi propaganda that was being disseminated in the United States in the 1930s. That was a specific reaction to get a handle, and in response to the pretty aggressive promotion from the Nazis, which, by the way, was funded by U.S. industrialists. So J.D. Rockefeller had a very brilliant, demonic but brilliant PR agent named Ivy Lee, And Ivy Lee was in addition to all the other things he was involved in, was the PR agent for IG Farben and basically an advisor to the Nazi regime and how to handle the Americans. And that blew up. And FDR's reaction was to force through this federal foreign agent registry program. So that's an interesting history.
Yeah, surprise, surprise, how things turn out. We're in 2025 right now. We're sort of experiencing the MAGA civil war over Israel, which, in my opinion, is a good thing. I think for whatever faults of Israel in Gaza, the one good thing that came out is that a lot of people began opening their eyes, which is, I think, a blessing. But I want to ask you at this point, as an American living in the United States and considering, the battle that the Kennedys, especially RFK, took against the Israel lobby, do you think in some sense we could say that the best days of the Israel lobby are now behind us, and now it's going to become only harder for them to try to convince Americans, especially during the election cycles, that Israel should matter to them one iota?
Well, they've clearly lost the young. They've even lost young Jews, and Jewish people of Jewish ancestry in this country are really heavily propagandized on behalf of Israel. I mean, it's like a whole process. Um, for instance, if you get bar mitzvah, it's usually somebody from Israel that is associated with a Hebrew school. They have all kinds of private Hebrew schools of various kinds. It's usually somebody straight from Israel who, in addition to teaching all the material that someone needs to learn for their bar mitzvah, also teaches them, or tries to indoctrinate them. And then there used to be, I don't know if there still are, but there used to be, Zionist summer camps, where literally they'd raise the Israeli flag and march around and talk about, the fatherland or the motherland or the homeland or the promised land or whatever, and then traumatize these kids and how dangerous it is to be Jewish, and Israel's our only. So the propagandizing of Jewish Americans of Jewish ancestry, it was unbelievably intense, and it's now failing. They have lost the younger generation of Jewish people of Jewish ancestry. They've also lost the larger generation, like the whole generation. They're even losing in large numbers the Christian Zionists, of which there are many. There are more Christian Zionists, strangely enough, in the United States than there are people in Israel. I mean, there's a huge swath of Christian Zionists. Some of those people, especially among the young, they're leaving. For instance, the great divide is this Charlie Kirk assassination, which has so many. I don't know how familiar people are with this in Poland, but it has so many parallels to the Kennedy assassination. Number one, it was done in broad daylight. There's all sorts of ways to kill somebody. You don't have to kill them, so dramatically. They wanted to kill this guy, Charlie Kirk, very dramatically. The lone gunman, right, shooting from an angle that was impossible, with a ridiculous justification that doesn't hold up. And then, of course, the FBI rolls into town like a clown circus, completely doing no investigation of every kind. I mean, it's absolutely identical. And what's clear to millions of people in that world who were fans of Charlie Kirk is that he was starting to speak openly and be very concerned about Israel's behavior. So there are many. So just short story. I mean, older people probably are still going to stick with the narrative, but the young generation, they have absolutely lost, and they're not getting them back. Now, does that matter? Because everyone, with very few exceptions of our federal legislatures and state legislators too, has been completely co-opted by Israel. So is that going to make a difference in policy? I'm afraid not. But there are many, many, many more millions of Americans that are absolutely willing to say no to Israel, point to the genocide. And I think more and more people are going to say, well, what actually happened to the Kennedy brothers and who all was involved in that? I think that's the arc of history. I hope.
Do you think, yeah, well, definitely, here's to hoping. But do you think, I mean, I was watching the Hanukkah celebrations yesterday at the White House, And, Trump is openly saying, hey, Miriam Adelson gave me $250 million. Miriam Adelson comes up and says, hey, you could go for a third term. She says, okay, you give me another $250 million. And this is coming from a president who I remember very clearly in 2016 mocked Marco Rubio for taking Sheldon Adelson's money. And now he's basically saying, yeah, I'll do anything the Sheldons tell me, the Adelsons tell me. He bragged about how Sheldon Adelson was able to walk into the White House. And I'm not even talking about his statement, pardon me, in Israel when he said, he asked Miriam Adelson publicly, who do you love more, the United States and Israel? And he said she refused to answer, so i.e. Israel. But I think the more this theater of absurd comes out of Trump, where some could say he's playing 3D chess. He's like saying, I'll admit this to the public, but, I'll try and do it in a friendly way to the Zionists. But he's saying it one way or another. I mean, can you imagine him saying, a Russian millionaire gave me $250 million. And oh, by the way, I'm not doing Russia's bidding. Nobody would buy that, right? So I think, to your point, the more absurd this becomes, more people are going to open their eyes, whether, the Israeli lobby likes it or not. And I think it's only natural for this to bring about political change, obviously over time, but maybe in our, digitalized social media world, it could even happen faster. What are your thoughts?
They can pour so much money into political campaigns, and those campaigns are not necessarily limited to just simply running a positive campaign. I mean, they can take down their political opponents, with attack ads, smears. Those should become less and less effective. But there's a problem. There's a structural problem. We call it absurd, and it clearly is absurd. But if you look at how cults operate, and there was a lot of cult-like behavior going on, cults have the most crazy ideas, right? I mean, they don't stand up. I'm afraid to mention any particular cult because they'll probably be after me. But they come up with the most ludicrous ideas that no sober or sane person would ever believe. But it becomes a selective device because there are people that do swallow and believe these things. And so there will be this hardcore of activist, hyper aggressive people who, no matter how absurd the positions become, will still be true believers. I mean, that's kind of like the core of being a true believer, that you accept the absurd. Trump is, of course, a terrible disappointment. He's done some good things. But I think we have to face the fact that I know there's a lot of fans. He's got a lot of fans around the world, but he's basically a white collar criminal. If you look, for instance, recently at the pardons that he's been given to absolute criminals, white collar, they didn't kill anybody, but they stole and defrauded people of hundreds of millions of dollars. And there seems to be a pay to play going on, especially among the Bitcoin world. And if people have not looked into that, you should look into it. It's the most horrifying thing for any country that thinks it's got a rule of law. It's a pay to play. You get pardoned, and or money ends up in somebody's Bitcoin account, and that gets laundered. And the Trump family has their own Bitcoin, and once money is put into the Bitcoin universe, it can be traced. But if you don't trace it, it's untraceable. It's unlike cash. Cash is really kind of hard to move, especially from bank to bank. But Bitcoin moves very easily. Now, again, if somebody wants to investigate, they can find out. But in the meantime, you can move all kinds of money around surreptitiously, and a lot of money is ending up in the family of Trump from white collar criminals. So it doesn't surprise me that he's in bed with people that will give him hundreds of millions of dollars. And he's disgraced himself forever. I mean, whatever good he's accomplished, he's undone it by supporting the genocide, which he clearly does. He can make all the noises he wants, but he's. I mean, the genocide would stop tomorrow if we stop sending weapons and the Brits stop doing the logistics. The war ends, the murders end. I mean, they'll have a few weapons left, but they'll run out of them very quickly, and then there's no more war. So it's sort of a long answer, but But since we're talking about Poland, I wonder if I could take you on a diversion about Polish history. Would you
Sure.
be interested in that? Okay.
Of
When you
course.
look at the Zionists, um,
Hmm.
they were very good at terrorism, and their 1948 campaign of village to village massacres and terror program forcing hundreds of thousands of people to leave their homes. You have to wonder, how did they get trained? Because military operations are not automatic. So a lot of people trained the Zionists in military operations. The British did. They partnered with them to help suppress the Palestinians briefly when there was a Palestinian revolt. That's when the Zionists learned a lot of things about intelligence. The French worked with, trained, and assisted the Zionists in committing terror against the British mandate.
Hmm.
Why? Because the British were doing dirty things in Syria and Lebanon, which was French territory, which the French considered theirs, and the way the French retaliated was by training the Zionists to cause problems for the British. But the very first training that the Zionists received in military operations, and it was in guerrilla warfare and in demolitions, actually was given to them by the Polish government pre-Nazi invasion. And the
Hmm.
reason for that was the Polish government realized they weren't, dense, that the Nazis were at the gate and were going to come in one way or another. And so they wanted to train everybody they possibly could, and for the resistance. And the Zionists raised their hand and said, "Show us." But there's an even is that something that's well known in Poland? I don't
I
know.
haven't studied that aspect of Jewish-Polish relations. I wouldn't be surprised. I can tell you that in interwar Poland, the Zionist movement was very powerful. As a matter of fact, there were even contemplated and, in some ways, even established contacts between extreme Zionists that were living in Poland, who already had the idea that we're going to have to go to Palestine someday. And for example, what's called the National Radical Camp in Poland, so a more even radical and extreme version of the mainline Polish nationalist party, where they actually discussed the issue of, listen, we have 3 million Jews in Poland. We generally don't want you here in Poland. You guys want to leave? Let's talk. So it was basically a
Gotcha.
win-win situation for both of them. Yeah.
There were
Um,
similar there were
with
similar negotiations. Sorry, pardon me.
Yeah, with the Germans, you were probably going to say
With the
about
Nazis, yeah, there was
yeah, yeah, yeah,
diplomatic relations. Yeah, but okay, so that's
definitely.
one aspect. That's one aspect of the
Hmm.
history. But this actually goes back even further. All right,
Hmm.
and it's something that I uncovered when I was doing another book that I'm working on now called Diabolical Errors, which is actually a history of medicine. But anyway, in
Hmm.
any event, there was a group called the Teutonic Knights. We're
Hmm.
talking about way back, and
Hmm.
they went to what is now Palestine, the Middle East, with the intention of killing people and stealing their land, and
Hmm.
the Crusades. And they failed. It didn't go well for the Teutonic Knights. So they came back to, I call it Germany, but obviously it wasn't Germany at the time. Germany is a
Hmm.
19th century construction. But they came back to Germany and with their tail between their legs, and they looked around at Poland and Lithuania, and
Hmm.
they said, "Wow, there's a lot of pagans living there," because at that time,
Hmm.
there were still pagans left in Europe. Um, I wonder if we could do a deal with the church. So they went to the church and they said, "Hey, church," because of course, Rome ruled Europe in that period, and you couldn't do anything. It's like the mafia; you couldn't do anything in Europe without the permission of Rome, right? So they went to the Rome and said, "Hey, there's a lot of pagans in Lithuania and Poland. If we go and start killing them and stealing their land, are you okay with that? And we'll
Yeah.
convert some of them to Catholicism. Are you okay with that?" And the Rome said, "Yeah, we're fine with that." So these Teutonic Knights, battle hardened people, went into Lithuania and Poland and started killing people and stealing their land. And as when you do that, you tend not to make friends. And so basically, this state that was originally run by the Teutonic Knights was basically a garrison state surrounded by people it had abused and murdered and robbed, which forced them to become a militarized society.
Yep.
Because if you created enemies everywhere, You better be good at fighting because you're going to be fighting all the time. Well, that state morphed into what's known as the Prussian state. And of course, we know the Prussian state was an extremely militarized society. Every aspect of Prussian society was run on a military ethos, including medicine, including education. And they, of course, had large swaths of where? Lithuania and Poland. Now here's where it all ties together. Who grew up in Prussian-controlled areas of Poland, what is now Poland and Lithuania? Zionists, right? So many of the most militant Zionists were indoctrinated just by growing up in the Prussian state, and they formed their attitudes of how to interact with the rest of the world based on the historical accident that they grew up in a highly militarized state. So when we look at Israel, what are we looking at? We're looking at, a lot of the most aggressive Zionists came out of Lithuania and Poland, not just Germany,
Yeah.
right? So we're looking at people that were conditioned by a brutal, authoritarian, militarized Prussian state, who, when they were forming their ideas of how to act in the world, that's what they grew up with. So, and of course, the Prussian state morphed into the Nazi regime. So when we look at Zionism, we're looking at sort of 19th century stuff, but it actually goes even further back. But there were the isms that grew up in Europe: communism, Nazism, fascism, Zionism. They were all like kissing cousins. In fact, if we take this back to Angleton and Italy and the fascists, can I take it there? Can do we have time? I don't want to. I tend to talk a
Go
lot
ahead,
because
go
there's
ahead.
all.
No,
Okay.
by all means, go ahead.
So this is a very important part of the history, because the other country that trained the Zionist military was Italy. So Angleton's father was a very high-ranking executive in a company called National Cash Register. Now, today that seems like a very quaint and unimportant industry, but you have to realize this was before computers. So all businesses were run with cash registers, and cash registers were relatively new. Most people kept their cash in a drawer and would just open the drawer and make change and write it down. The idea of you'd hit a button and the cash register would open and it would record everything. This was high tech. So Angleton's father went over to Italy, and he took the franchise. He actually owned the franchise for National Cash Register in Italy. And I should really say fascist Italy, because this was at the time of the rise of the fascists in Italy, which preceded the Nazis by 10 years, by the way. People should realize that. The Italian fascists were already doing what they were doing in the 20s. So if you were going to function as a business executive, as an entrepreneur, attempting to interact with all the businesses in Italy, you better be fascist friendly. And so young James Angleton grew up in a family that was hosting fascist business leaders from the time he was a child. So very fascist friendly. He was fluent in Italian. He went to a very famous boarding school, and then he ended up going to I forget where he went to college. Yale. Sorry, of course, he went to Yale, which is the breeding grounds of the CIA. And then when World War II came, he joined the OSS, and he was put in charge of Italian things.
Yes.
And then he was also, when the CIA formed, he was in charge of the Italian desk in Italy. He was involved in two things there. Number one, there was a fellow named the German guy, Galen. Galen was a German officer, high-ranking general, and when the Nazis ran into Eastern Europe, of course they murdered everybody they could. But then they had the same problem the Teutonic Knights had, and the same problem the Israeli state has, is you've just made millions of enemies, and now you need a very well-run occupation force, which involves a lot of intelligence and a lot of terror. And so one of Galen's the people under Galen, one of their jobs was to go in and, there's a village and they've been protesting. Well, you go and you take all the men out and you shoot them in broad daylight. and convey the message of how the world is going to operate. So that was Richard Galen, and he was picked up by the CIA. They worked closely together, and then he was given over back to the Germans to help run German intelligence. Angleton was part of the group that facilitated that relationship. Angleton was also very helpful to ex-fascists who wanted to get out, who want to go to prison and not be executed, and make their way out of Italy. There was a rat line through Italy that was one way to escape Germany after the war. And then, of course, there were a lot of Italians that had to escape too. And it was Angleton's job to block those people. That was his job. Those were our enemies. These were criminals. These were war criminals. And somehow he was not very effective, let's put it this way, at allowing vast numbers of ex-Nazis and ex-fascists to move through Italy and out to Latin America and then get laundered back into the United States. The other thing was, when wars end, to conduct a war, you have to move huge amounts of munitions somewhere, right? You have to move them. And there were a lot of munitions in Italy, just sitting there in warehouses. And, this is a little known fact, but after World War II and after the Allies defeated the Japanese in the Pacific, there were vast quantities of weapons, tanks, jeeps, mortars, missiles, everything you can imagine in Asia. And they were warehoused in Korea and Vietnam. And the same thing happened. And interesting how we ended up having wars there. And there were vast quantities of weapons in Italy. And somehow James Angleton, who was supposed to be supervising what was going on in Italy on behalf of the CIA, was not very effective in blocking the transmission, the shipping of those weapons from Italy to Israel. Now, during the fascist regime, the Zionists were extremely fascist friendly. In fact, it was not uncommon for Zionists to publicly call themselves fascists because World War II hadn't happened yet, and fascism did not have a bad reputation. In fact, the Rockefellers were very fascist friendly. They built a glorious pavilion to the Italian fascist state on Fifth Avenue as part of their Rockefeller Center. It's bigger than the British pavilion. So many elites loved the idea of fascism, and the Zionists loved it. But there was another reason the Zionists loved fascism. They admired what Mussolini did to the Libyans and to the Ethiopians. And for people that aren't familiar with the history, the Nazis had the goal of taking over Europe, especially Eastern Europe, and the Italian fascists had the goal of taking over the Eastern Mediterranean. They wanted to restore the former Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire controlled, the Eastern Mediterranean. And so as part of their mission, they slaughtered, I believe it was 300,000 Ethiopian civilians. In fact, the very first use of chemical weapons against civilians, deliberately bombing them, was done by the Italian fascists. And the Zionist fascists looked at that and said, "Great, we love this. You get it. This is what it's all about." And so many Zionist fascists, Zionists, moved to Italy, where they were embraced by the fascists. And there was even a naval base created for them, specifically, wasn't part of the main naval academy of Italy, but it was affiliated with it. And the Zionists had their own little Zionist naval academy where they were taught to operate ships and so on, which very important if you're going to move weapons, because you're not going to move the weapons in a truck via Bulgaria and Turkey and Syria. That's not going to work. You need ships. So many of the weapons that ended up in Palestine that were murder Palestinians came through Italy, through Italian ports, when James Angleton just happened to be CIA chief there, and he was very ineffective in stopping that criminal activity. So the link between Angleton and the Zionists and they still are fascists. Obviously, the Zionist
Mhm.
fascists is not just 60s. It goes all the way back to the 40s, and it actually goes all the way to his childhood, because he was raised by a fascist-friendly father who was a very important industrialist in fascist Italy.
Well, wow. Touched upon so much there. Obviously, we're Operation Paperclip. We're fairly familiar. One other aspect, just to end off here, which is, I guess, interesting in the relevant current geopolitical turmoil, is also how the CIA cooperated with facilitating the extremists from the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the so-called Banderites, and Stepan Bandera himself. That's a whole different issue, but the connections with the CIA run deep all the way up until today, obviously. And there's many parallels of how the Zionists existed, and how Ukraine as a modern nation state and the Ukrainian nationalist movements existed also. But I think I read in one account, it actually might have been in Mearsheimer and Walt's book on the Israel lobby, that one Israeli leader apparently at one point admitted that we got the ideas for tactics or occupation tactics basically from what was done to us in the Warsaw Ghetto by the Germans. So we basically emulated what the Germans did to us, and it worked. So that admission is out there somewhere. I forgot who it's attributed to, but sometimes you get them on the record saying fairly honest things, which is good in a way. But on the other hand, it's bad because they actually execute them. So I'm
Well, they were,
hoping
don't
that a
forget,
lot of
they
Mhm.
were also trained by the British in how to do population suppression in the Mandate too. So they got training there.
Mhm.
See, they claim, that it's all about the Holocaust. No, they were already doing
Of
brutal
course,
things long before the Holocaust.
of course. Ken, thank you for the discussion today. Thank you for your time. Guys, make sure to check out the link. The link to the book is in the description box. I think there's so many other topics that we'll be discussing in the future. And by the way, those Teutonic Knights that you mentioned, Ken, they got their behind whooped by the combined Polish and Lithuanian, by the way, Catholic armies, but real Catholic armies who saw through their BS. At the Battle of Tannenberg in 1410, or the Battle of Grunwald, as we call it, is one of Poland's greatest battles. So after that, they really wouldn't be able to come back to their former glory. So that's one of the greatest, pieces of Polish history that we're very proud of, that we actually broke the neck of these guys and sent a message to Rome that, hey, the guys that you were promoting for as long as, Catholic knights, they're anything but. So Rome, thankfully, at some point also saw through the light. Hopefully, in symbolic and political ways, we'll be able also to break the back of the Zionist behemoth that has done so much evil. And I'm sure your book contributes to that in many regards in the United States and in the world. Thank you once again, Ken, for your time, and hopefully we'll see you soon here on DR Global.
Thanks so much.